The original Castlevania hero Simon Belmont returns to battle Dracula once again, or for the first time. Super Castlevania IV is a confusingly named game, not helped by its multiple plots depending on the language. This is the fourth console game to use the name Castlevania, and that's the only reason the number 4 is in the title. The word Super was thrown on the front to indicate that it's on the Super Nintendo, and perhaps a more appropriate title would just be Super Castlevania. The number really makes no sense, because in Japan, this game was considered a complete retelling of Castlevania 1 with brand new levels. The North American translation attempted to convert this into a sequel of Castlevania II, although it is no longer seen this way in the present day. Castlevania III sits awkwardly in between, taking place 200 years before any of these events. But enough talk, a wise vampire once said. Have at you. Enter the player's name and off we go. The very beginning, as is tradition, lets you play around without any danger. Well, except if you miss the jump to the drawbridge. I could explain the candles all over again and the things that come out of them, but the new and exciting things here are available without any of those things. The player has better control of Simon in the air now, so when he jumps, you're not locked into that direction. And more exciting to me is his whip control. He's only ever been able to whip directly in front of him, and now he can whip directly up and down, and even diagonally. This is incredibly useful and a much needed overhaul to make this game stand out over its predecessors on the older console. Seriously, an 8-directional whip is a massive upgrade. Block 1 continues to be a solid introduction. It has basic enemies you can test your whip on, and introduces another common gimmick using the whip like a grappling hook. You can first test this without any risks before you need to cross gaps using it. The castle courtyard has its own gimmick with a playable front layer and back layer. Featuring this in the first stage made me think it would be recurring later. Sadly, it was only used in this introductory stage, and its potential wasn't maximized, but that's my only nitpick of the first block. And just listen to the soundtrack that goes along with the beginning here. It's so good that it's officially the theme of Simon Belmont. Castlevania music had endless new possibilities with the Super Nintendo's 16-bit powers. As you might expect, the first block ends with a boss, and it's not difficult yet. I will say that a lot of the bosses in this game felt bland, though. The 8-directional whip can now damage bosses from many angles, making battles feel similar. There were some new ideas for boss designs, but in the end, I felt most fights followed the simple sequence of entering with enough health and just whipping away. It's much easier to enter battles with more health now, and I appreciate that element. The traditional health-boosting meat now has some smaller portions that can be found from candles, and they're scattered more generously than before. As we move on to Block 2, I need to comment on the graphics. The sprites and environments on the SNES were able to display many more shades of colors than before, so it's a good-looking game as always with Konami. The trouble is, it's a little muddy. When you have all these different shades of dark colors, it occasionally gets confusing, with sprites blending into the background and foreground. Outlines would have helped, although I don't know if that's the best solution for this game. Again, everything looks good, but there needed to be more definition between the background and foreground, a trap that many SNES artists fell into. Still, it's far from the worst offender on the console, and I mostly stayed out of trouble. To quickly address Block 2, we see some returning gimmicks such as the strong water currents. The water sometimes flows down slopes, and I can't remember seeing slopes in any previous Castlevania titles. Of course, the developers opted to keep using the infamous stairs more often than slopes for most of the game, although their functionality was also improved. No, you still can't jump from the stairs for some reason, but you can at least jump onto them from another platform and detach from them to drop below. Block 2's river flows into Block 3's cave, and the progression of this block makes it my favorite in the game. The 3 substages all have their own atmosphere and music track, and the transition from the cave theme into the dark waterfall theme is magical. I love the shared motifs. Climbing up next to the waterfall is a challenging vertical section, leading into substage 3-3, the ruins in the moat. I would say that this is the first difficulty spike in the game, and it's placed well. You really can't let your guard down. The atmosphere continues to build as Simon climbs the ruined tower, and the water rises near the top as the boss battle begins. Atmosphere building might be this game's strongest suit, especially with short map cutscenes in between each block with their own short tune. At this point, however, Castlevania fans may realize that this game is missing a popular feature from Castlevania III. There are no choices of paths, the game is linear. On top of that, the only character you can control is Simon. That one I can justify with the story of the game, as it's meant to be a retelling of Castlevania 1, which was just Simon's time to shine. I understand the disappointment regarding the linear progression, though. The reason for having a choice of paths was to meet new characters, but even so, I felt that the game was slightly too short without these choices. Instead of this, the main offering was retuning the mechanics, and deeper into the game, I appreciated that retuning even more. As you continue into Block 4, the developers start to experiment in fun ways. This stage is all about moving parts, although they're introduced very slowly. Some of the enemies hide in the walls and even the backgrounds, so the regular platforming has a new twist. Towards the end of 4.1, the player has to deal with dropping platforms and platforms that turn over when jumped on. I wasn't a huge fan of the latter since their behavior was too finicky. This part is less memorable since each substage brings a much bigger moving element than these platforms. It all begins when Simon climbs into a big open room in stage 4.2 with nothing around except a hoop for the whip to hold onto. Suddenly the room starts rotating. This seems like it was only added to show off the SNES Mode 7 graphics, which allow the backgrounds to move and rotate in various ways. The rotation is slow, and the only challenge is dodging a few flying Medusa heads on a relatively small platform when the room is on its side. Then it's another slow rotation for a further 90 degrees and just waiting for a bridge to form so you can move on. Undeniably an impactful part of the game, but the gameplay is very bland. And it stays rather bland through 4.3 with simple platforming through a background rotating like a cylinder. The physics aren't affected at all, and most people found this background to be excessive. They left the background alone in 4.4, but instead you're greeted with a constant loop of giant blocks slowly rising through the stage. This part was a lot more successful, although if you miss your exit on the other side of the blocks, you're probably doomed. Unfortunately, my favorite part of this experimental stage block, was the beginning, the least experimental. I have to say though, most of the stage designs in this game are really good. Perhaps it's my own fault that I had trouble picking out specific highlights to mention in this review, but I promise it's good. I was hooked even when I was dying a lot as the game got harder. Block 5 was a curious interlude made up of only 2 substages without any bosses. Even the music was low-key. Block 6 was where I felt the difficulty really kick in, although thankfully it didn't kick me in the face like I expect with early Castlevanias. I appreciated the difficulty of this game because Konami successfully balanced it. I can't put my finger on how they changed it to work this way, but it probably loops back to Simon's overhauled skills. The Block 5 interlude is underappreciated, as it's the last stage that doesn't really have anything to do with a castle. These games like to use more spooky themes than just haunted castles, but this is a retelling of Castlevania 1, where almost everything took place around a big castle. Castlevania 4 reimagines this castle tour by giving the remaining blocks distinctive themes. It all starts in the Grand Hall in Block 6, and you have no idea just how grand this castle is yet. It's amusing to me that Simon is climbing above the hall and has to jump across the giant swinging chandeliers. And upstairs, it seems like dancing ghosts were enjoying a feast on tables that also want to attack. It's an unusually colorful stage, including the ghosts and whatever the heck this thing is. Block 7 is the castle's library, and who knew books could be so scary? Then it's the dungeons in Block 8. I died a lot, which is to be expected. Most of the time I died early on in the block, and that's more convenient when it comes to game overs. It does seem a little backwards to have the hardest parts first, but it was more on me for not figuring out the correct way to get through. Moving on to Block 9, it seems that Dracula has been hoarding a whole lot of treasure, as this level has Simon traversing heaps and heaps of gold. It's deceptively hard as well, both in the level and the boss. A giant bat forms from a large collection of gold coins, and as you whip it, some of the coins fling off into you. We're at Block A now. Once again, it was simply too complicated to write Block 10 at the top of the screen. Now, for any game that reaches a high difficulty, it's pretty easy to nitpick and find what you don't like. I'm certainly guilty of doing that, and I could do that more here. It's not the most enjoyable ending to a game, but I enjoyed it more than the other final stretches in the series. So, let's talk about some positives instead. A Castlevania game wouldn't be complete without the clock tower, and that's where we are now. We have some moving parts, and the jumps across the spinning gears were smoother than we've seen previously. The music is also a new arrangement of an all-time classic song from Castlevania II, Bloody Tears. And the boss arena is one of the most creative yet in the series, taking place on a large clock face. Lucky that the hands are stuck at an easy time to stand on. The final area is kind of just another tower, but it does well to represent the last climb to Dracula. Block B takes us back to Castlevania 1's music with Vampire Killer, followed by Castlevania 3's Beginning. Both of these are from the first stages of their games. I bet you couldn't tell that for a song named Beginning, and yet they fit in extremely well here. It's like being teased that you're not quite at the end, and creates a very intense atmosphere. The descending section is much harder than it may appear, and a lot of people have valid complaints about the ascent afterwards. While it is nice to have the ability to jump onto the stairs, it's too quirky to consistently achieve on a controller, and those jumps are required here. And then the stairs fall away behind you. I also didn't like that the rising platforms after this blindly take you into a ceiling of spikes. The final two stages, B3 and B4, are only made up of bosses. Konami tried something a little different for the finale of Castlevania IV, and I have no strong feelings on this boss rush. They're all new bosses, which makes for quite the challenge. Fighting 3 bosses in one substage would be an insanely unreasonable challenge in an earlier game, but it gets a pass here. The first boss is easy to learn, and you can fully heal before going into the next boss. The third boss is notable as he always manages to be in this series. Welcome back, Death. I haven't really missed you at all. Fortunately, Death is a checkpoint in the middle of a substage. I don't understand the checkpoint system here. In the first game, each substage was a checkpoint and game overs would restart the block. In this game, this is still true, now with added checkpoints. I feel like more substages would make this more obvious. There is one issue I take with these bosses, and that's in their health bar. This late in the game, it takes a lot more to defeat them, so it doesn't always look like your attacks are doing anything. There were times when I was seemingly one hit away according to the bar, but I was deceived. B4 looks very familiar. It's the same staircase up to the left into Dracula's room. It also happens to be a game over checkpoint, so if you make it all the way here, you're safe. I wanted to take an intentional game over by jumping through the stairs, but I lived. There's a secret down here which I found completely by accident. You get fully healed, maximum hearts for your sub-weapon, a cross to use as that sub-weapon, and level 3 to throw 3 of them at once. Even with all that, this fight took me over 45 minutes. Dracula goes through 3 different phases, and it would have been helpful to have separate health bars like before. The fire is deceptively difficult, although I felt like I was being dumb through all of my mistakes. Yes, I got frustrated here, but I can't think of a reasonable criticism. It's a very well-made boss fight, in fact. The animation to finish it all off is very satisfying. The only thing is, the credits after that don't feel satisfying. The song choice doesn't seem right. It doesn't have to be anything grand, but it feels like the structure is wrong, and the emotions from the music don't really relate back to the game in my opinion. Oh well, I still took out the Count himself. After all that, it's difficult to judge which game is better, Castlevania III or Castlevania IV. I have to say I was more impressed with Castlevania III, but the better overall experience goes to Castlevania IV. It may be missing some content in comparison, but Simon's improved whip skills help the gameplay much more than I expected. Without this, we may not have had the same smooth experience for most of the game. The endgame feels much more balanced than in any other Castlevania title, largely thanks to these mechanics. I had more positive things to say overall, although I can't help but feel that the potential wasn't maximized. Therefore, my final score for Super Castlevania IV will be 8.2 out of 10. If you want to get into the classic Castlevanias, I now think this is the best starting point. The fairness is a big reason for that, along with Simon's abilities, of course. The presentation is wonderful, and it's a very powerful soundtrack to go along with it. Most classic Castlevanias are also remembered as being linear, so if you're unfamiliar with the series, you won't really be disappointed by the downgrade. Regardless of the series, this is a game that I can easily recommend, and it's not hard to find either. There's always the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, and other collections like the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. Fittingly, Super Castlevania IV was first released on Halloween 1991 over in Japan. It didn't get rave reviews, however. Famitsu's average score was 7.25 out of 10. Not bad, but a little lower than Castlevania III. This was somewhat surprising because they often complained about unfair difficulty, and Castlevania IV mostly fixed that. US magazines were all for the game, however, holding it at the top of the series rankings. It had the honor of making the front cover of Nintendo Power with a nice big preview and an excellent score of 17.5 out of 20. Electronic Gaming Monthly was also very excited, including previews and multiple issues leading up to the release. I wasn't able to find a score from EGM, but 6 years later, they ranked it at number 20 on their list of the 100 best games of all time. Tell me, did you agree with the points I've made? What rating would you give Super Castlevania IV for the SNES, initially released in 1991? Remember to like the video and subscribe to keep Dracula in his grave. As ever, thank you for watching, and please continue to be your own unique self.
You great big lummox, you.